Hello, this is Impact, bringing you all the day's top stories, and later in the programme, more news in depth. I'm Philippa Thomas. A stark warning on climate change. Rich countries must spend billions to protect against the impact of floods and rising temperatures. We'll hear more about the role business has to play and what sort of initiatives can be taken right now to build up climate resilience. Fukushima's toxic legacy. Now, Japan says it might have to dump 1 million tons of contaminated water into the sea. Welcome to the programme. We're live for the next 45 minutes and you can always give me your views at Philippa BBC. Act now or pay an even heavier price later. That's the warning from a global commission on the measures needed to adapt to climate change. It says rich countries must invest $1.8 trillion to safeguard livelihoods, food and water supplies. Early warning systems for hurricanes and restoring forests are among the many proposals. Our climate change correspondent Victoria Gill reports.
From record-breaking heat waves to more violent storms, scientists agree that the impacts of climate change are playing out around the world. So the Global Commission on Adaptation has outlined what it calls concrete solutions to adapt to this reality. Its key proposal is that the richest countries should invest now to protect the poorest and most vulnerable, safeguarding livelihoods, coastal cities, food and water supplies. It's identified 5 areas for the world to invest in over the next decade. These are early warning systems for storms and high tides, improving agriculture, safeguarding water supplies, protecting and restoring mangrove forests around vulnerable coasts, and building more climate-resilient urban infrastructure. Something as simple as this project to paint New York City roofs white can reflect more sunlight, keeping buildings and neighbourhoods cool. Investing a total of £1.5 trillion in a more climate-resilient future, the Commission says, will bring measurable benefits. And its report puts a value on those benefits, all those avoided losses and social, environmental and economic gains of more than £5 trillion.
Well, Victoria's with me now. And Victoria, we can see the passion around the world for environmental action, but people often feel somewhat helpless as well. So tell us more about the sort of things that can be done now.
I think that's what's interesting about this particular report, Philippa, because it's kind of a cost-benefit analysis. It's like an economic plan for actually actions, really specific actions, strategies that can be followed to make the world adapt to climate change. So it takes the fundamental foundation that climate change is happening, it's a reality, it's affecting people and communities and countries all around the world, and that we need to plan for it. They pull no punches, the Global Commission on Adaptation that put together this report, in the urgency of that action. They basically say we need to spend this money, so this $1.8 trillion all around the world now. But they lay out this investment strategy and really point out that there's a return on that investment. All of those sort of that avoided damage, protection of livelihoods, but also economic growth. So one of the things that we saw in that report was painting roofs white in New York. Now there's also some
That looks quite, it looks literally cosmetic, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But really remind us what it does.
So it's a really simple reflective coating on a rooftop in an extremely built up urban environment. And so for every building that's painted white, you get this big reflective, reflecting the sun's energy, so reflecting that heat. So you get this impact, this measurable impact on the heat of that building, but also cooling that neighbourhood. But there's also, after Hurricane Sandy, there's obviously some repairs that needed to be done in New York City, but there's also been planning for the future in investing in protecting and engineering those coastlines. So things like making beaches wider will make a city like New York investable in the future because it's sort of it's a more climate resilient city. So it's a long way away from, say, coastlines that are protected by mangrove forests and, the poorest farmers that are already suffering the impacts of drought. A rich city like New York, but every single place in the world needs to think about climate resilience because we're dealing with this new reality.
And to pick up that idea about mangrove forests, what specifically has been done? I know that we've got some images of above it.
So that's another really lovely example of where it's fairly cheap and really simple to protect about 18 million people that live on vulnerable coasts from flood damage and from these storm surges, because mangroves, these natural underwater forests, are so effective at doing that naturally, but they've been really threatened and damaged by development. So there are systems in place now, there are projects in place, they're actually fairly cheap, just building up bamboo structures that trap sediment, that basically bring back the base for the mangroves to just naturally re-establish to protect all of these vulnerable coasts.
And that's a really good example of a simple idea that it's good to spread. Victoria, thank you very much. And coming up in just a moment, we'll hear from Faker Sibesma, who's the global climate leader for the World Bank Group. And we're going to talk to him about how business can play a larger role in this fight for a low-carbon, climate-resilient global economy. Japan says it may have to release more than 1 million tonnes of contaminated water from the Fukushima nuclear power plant into the Pacific Ocean. The Environment Minister says storage space at Fukushima is running out fast. Fishermen, environmental groups and the South Korean government are all protesting. Here's our Tokyo correspondent, Rupert Wingfield-Hayes.
So the issue that they have at Fukushima is that every day they pump out around 200 tonnes of contaminated water from the reactor buildings at the damaged nuclear plant. And that radioactive water contains lots of different radioactive isotopes, and they put that through a complex filtration process that takes most of the radioactive isotopes out. But one isotope is left, and apparently the technology does not exist to remove it, and that is tritium. And so this is tritiated water. And what they've been doing for the last 8 years or more is storing this water. And over the years, you can imagine it's just built up and up and up. And they've been building more and more huge water tanks there to store this water. And now they've got to 1 million tonnes of stored water. And they say in 3 years from now, at the end of 2022, they will actually run out of space at the plant to build more tanks. And so the suggestion has been made, and this has long been a plan, is that it should be released into the Pacific Ocean. And in fact, today we've heard the Environment Minister saying that he now supports that plan. But it is hugely controversial. And the biggest opposition here in Japan comes from the fishing community. Fishermen in Fukushima suffered greatly after the nuclear disaster. Many people to this day still are resistant to buying seafood products from that part of Japan, and not just seafood, even agricultural products are still face discrimination. And so the last thing they want is another large release of radioactive water into the sea to turn consumers against them again. There is also international pressure from environmental groups like Greenpeace and political pressure, big political pressure from the South Korean government, Japan's closest neighbour, which has said it will take any release very, very seriously indeed. If you look at the scientific evidence, on balance, scientists say this release would not be a danger to human or animal life. Tritium is not a particularly active radioactive isotope. It is passed through the human body very quickly in about 10 days, so its biological half-life is very short. And the main reason is because the Pacific Ocean is just so vast. So even releasing 1 million tonnes of water into the Pacific, it would be diluted very, very quickly in the enormous ocean out there. Nevertheless, I think they have kicked it down the road for 8 years, and I think it's likely the Japanese government will continue to kick it down the road just because there is so much political opposition here at home and from abroad.
The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been meeting his top ministers as he tries to find a way forward on Brexit. The government has now controversially suspended Parliament. Opponents claim that's to stop MPs interfering. In a passing shot, though, lawmakers passed a bill giving Mr Johnson until the 19th of October to strike a departure deal with the European Union or ask for a delay. Well, the deep divisions on Brexit were on full display in the House of Commons, as Jessica Parker reports.
The leader of the opposition cannot lead.
This parliamentary session, which has seen its fair share of feuding, ended in acrimony in the early hours of this morning. A number of MPs temporarily tried to stop the Speaker from leaving the Commons, some of them holding up signs saying "silenced." and John Bercow made it clear how he felt about the 5-week suspension of Parliament.
I'm perfectly happy, as I've advised others, to play my part, but I do want to make the point that this is not a standard or normal prorogation. It is. I don't require any assistance from you, Mr. Stevenson. You wouldn't have the foggiest idea where to start in seeking to counsel me on this important. I require no response from you. I require no response from you.
Then, as Conservative MPs left the chamber to take part in the ongoing proceedings, cries of shame rang out from opposition benches. It all followed a final and fiery debate on the government's call for a snap election in mid-October. The House again did not support the move, and Boris Johnson again made clear his view about the prospect of a delay to Brexit.
No matter how many devices this Parliament invents to tie my hands, I will strive, Mr. Speaker, to get an agreement in the national interest.
I hope the Prime Minister will reflect on the issue of prorogation and shutting down Parliament to avoid a government being held to account, because that is exactly what he has done today and proposes to do to this country.
Now conference season looms, with MPs due back in Westminster on the 14th of October. A Queen's speech then may spell the start of a new session, but the old and very deep divisions will likely still be there. Jessica Parker, BBC News.
Well, with me is our global affairs correspondent, Naomi Grimley. Naomi, what can Boris Johnson do now?
Well, his options are very narrow indeed, because on the one hand, he's been deprived of having an early election before that crucial end of October deadline. The earliest an election can now be is around the 20th of November. And on the other hand, Parliament has legislated to say they want to see him ask for an extension and go to the EU and ask for that. So really, his options are so narrow. There's even talk that he might have to resign and fight an election as a leader of the opposition, or even perhaps go back to Theresa May's deal and somehow tweak that controversial Northern Ireland backstop issue in his favour so that he can get it through the House of Commons. Crucially, though, that would have to be with some Labour support.
The Irish Prime Minister told him very firmly yesterday, even if you do Brexit, that's not the end of it all. That's not a clean break. That's the beginning. We've had some really interesting news out of Brussels today on that. Indeed, that's because the new EU Trade Commissioner is going to be an Irishman, Phil Hogan. And so perhaps Leo Varadkar knew that and was alluding to that when he said it was going to be a Herculean task. This figure, Phil Hogan, who's known as a bit of a bruiser in politics, is very knowledgeable when it comes to trade deals. He helped broker the EU-Japan trade deal, and also he will be key. And it's a sign that the EU really does place a premium on this issue of the border and what happens there. And it may well be, I was just reading an interview with him, he's suggesting that Boris Johnson may well realise that in the end the solution comes if you put that border down the Irish Sea. We could talk more about that, but no time right now. Naomi, thank you very much. In other news, North Korea has fired 2 unidentified projectiles into the sea just hours after expressing willingness to resume nuclear talks with the United States. Negotiations between Pyongyang and Washington have been gridlocked since February's second summit between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump ended without a deal. Jack Ma, one of China's richest men, is stepping down today as chairman of the e-commerce giant Alibaba. Ma helped found the company nearly 2 decades ago and has been the face of it ever since. He is handing over the reins to Alibaba's chief executive, Daniel Zhang. It sounds like something from the Cold War. The CIA forced to evacuate a spy working in the top levels of the Russian government. Well, this report comes from leaks to the US media. The Kremlin has played down the claims, calling them pulp fiction, but a spokesman has admitted that what he calls a low-level official has been fired. Let's get more from Moscow and the BBC's Sarah Rainsford. Sarah, what do we know?
Well, quite an extraordinary story. As you say, coming initially from reports in the United States that the CIA had to extract an agent, someone who's described as one of the CIA's most valuable assets here in Russia, because they were worried he was going to be exposed. Now, when that report came out, the Russian media very quickly started to name a name. They mentioned a man called Oleg Smolenkov. And what we've had today is the Kremlin confirming that a man by that name did indeed work for the presidential administration. But Dmitry Peskov saying that all these talks of extracting, rescuing a spy were pulp fiction, he said. And yet this man, he confirmed, was a member of staff of the presidential administration. Now, he did say he was a low-level member of staff. He said he didn't hold a senior position and he didn't have, as such, access to President Putin. He did, though, apparently get fired a couple of years ago, round about the exact time when Russian media are reporting that Mr. Smolenkov travelled to Montenegro with his family and then disappeared. Mr. Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, did say that he had no idea where Mr. Smolenkov was now. He said that wasn't up to the Kremlin to investigate, but certainly the timing does match exactly when the CIA we're being told, was forced to extract someone, an agent, from the Kremlin administration. So the suggestion, first of all, that they had a source so closely placed to President Putin is fascinating in itself. And then the idea that he was extracted because apparently he was at risk of being uncovered, again, making this quite a tale. And at the moment, just the details beginning to emerge.
Really extraordinary. Sarah, thanks for getting us right up to date there. Still to come here on Impact. Watchtowers, armed guards and razor wire. We have a special report on the camp set up by Myanmar for any Rohingya Muslims trying to return home.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning, and freedom will be defended. The United States will hunt down and punish those responsible.
Bishop Tutu now becomes spiritual leader of 100,000 Anglicans here, of the blacks in Soweto Township as well as the whites in their rich suburbs.
We say to you today, in a loud and a clear voice, enough of blood and tears. Enough!
The difficult decision. It's an exodus of up to 60,000 people caused by the uneven pace of political change in Eastern Europe.
I am free!
Welcome back to Impact on BBC World News. To remind you of our top story this hour, a leading group of scientists and politicians is calling on the world's richest nations to put forward $1.8 trillion over 10 years to help to tackle climate change. Iranian activists say a young female football fan who set herself on fire in Tehran a week ago has died. The woman was arrested as she tried to enter a stadium to watch a football match, which women aren't allowed to do in Iran. She then set herself alight outside a court after being told she was going to be jailed for 6 months. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by the BBC's Women's Affairs reporter, Feranak Amidi. And Feranak, a huge reaction to this.
Yes, there has been a huge reaction. You know, this campaign, women have been campaigning to enter the stadiums, football stadiums mainly, for the past 20 years. But for a big chunk of these 2 decades, they haven't really got the support they needed. But now, unfortunately, this sad, tragic event has caused people to rally up and actually voice their concern and say that this is it. You know, if women have to lose their lives in order to get to the stadium, authorities need to listen, and this ban should be lifted on women.
Tell us more about the young woman. What do we know? She's been called the Blue Girl.
She's been called the Blue Girl because she was supporting the team Istiqlal, which in Farsi means independent. It's a very popular team in Tehran, and she supported that team, and that's the game she was trying to go and watch. It was Istiqlal playing Al Ain, and she was arrested outside of the stadium. Her name is Sahar Khodayari, and she was 29 years old. This is what we know about her, but there are also these unconfirmed reports that her sister, while she was out on bail, Sahar, when she was out on bail, her sister had told the authorities and the court and the judge that she suffered from bipolar disorder and that they should, take it a little easy on her because this is really, but on the mainstream media, we are seeing officials also reacting. An Iranian MP, a woman, Parvana Salahshur, she put a statement out on Twitter saying that this is the fault of the patriarchy. This is a language we don't see used much by especially MPs and authorities in Iran, but she said that this is the result of a system where the men are deciding for the women, and all of us are part of this, and all of us are guilty in the death of Sahar Khodayari.
Interesting that those voices are being aired. What are you watching for now?
Well, we are watching. I'm also interested to see how FIFA, the federation, is going to react to this, because a lot of Iranians are calling on FIFA to boycott Iran's football federation and also other sports federations. And this is also something very new, because before there were a niche, a minority of Iranians were supportive of boycotting Iran sports to get women and women's voices to be heard for this demand. But now we are seeing more people saying that the Iranian Football Federation needs to be boycotted, and they want to see that. So I think everybody's looking and watching to see how FIFA is going to react.
I think we should stay across this story and probably talk to you again. Fair enough. Thank you very much. A special report now, 2 years after more than 700,000 Muslim Rohingyas fled from a savage military operation and remain stuck in overcrowded camps in Bangladesh. A second attempt to start repatriating these refugees failed last month when none of those selected would agree to go. They were afraid, they said, for their safety. Well, the government of Myanmar says it is committed to bringing them back. But our correspondent Jonathan Head has found evidence that the authorities in Rakhine State have been erasing all trace of their villages.
The Tompioletwe border post in northern Rakhine State. An immigration officer shows us lists of the Rohingya refugees his government had approved last month. They want the world to understand how ready they are to have at least some of them back, though so far they've had no takers.
Well, we've been allowed to come right up here to the border with Bangladesh, and it's through these rusting gates that Myanmar officials say they were expecting hundreds, even thousands of Rohingya refugees to come under the latest repatriation scheme. But of course, without any promises of citizenship, without any real investigation into the abuses they suffered, and most of all, without any reassurances about what kind of future they have, we know that at the moment none of the Rohingyas over there on that side of the border are willing to make this crossing. If significant numbers of Rohingya refugees do decide to come back, this is where they're likely to spend at least their first 2 months. It's a transit camp, and as you can see, it would be pretty basic living. It's also fenced in with watchtowers and armed police, and it's unlikely they'll be free to come and go. But most of them will not be able to go back to their villages because they've not just been destroyed by the violence of 2 years ago, but they've continued to be demolished even since then. In fact, this very camp is built on the site of what was an intact Rohingya village that was then bulldozed.
Satellite images showed 2 relatively undamaged settlements at the end of 2017, which within a few months are flattened to make way for the transit camp. Yet the camp administrator seems unaware of this.
Why did you destroy the village, the Muslim village that was here, to build this camp?
There's no village in this area, he said. There are no villages where we built the camp. 2 years ago, at the height of the military campaign against the Rohingyas, I was able to film a Muslim neighbourhood called Myotuji, which had just been burnt. Today, on exactly the same stretch of road, there's a newly constructed government complex instead. Myotuji has completely vanished. We were also shown a relocation camp where returning refugees are expected to live, closely monitored by the security forces. There is a large new police barracks close by. Here too, satellite images show that a Rohingya village was demolished to make way for it.
This is perhaps the strangest part of this tightly controlled government trip. They brought us to a village called Indin, which is notorious for a massacre of 10 Muslim men in September 2017, and for which 2 Reuters journalists went to prison after investigating it. Now, they brought us here, showing us scenes of ordinary life, to stress that it's all peaceful and harmonious now with the non-Muslim population. But if you come over here, behind this barbed wire fence is where the Muslims used to live. There's no trace of them now. They've constructed some kind of government barracks behind there, and it's quite clear that the Muslims are never coming back here.
Jonathan Head there. Coming up here on Impact, the sequel is out to the classic novel The Handmaid's Tale, and we're talking to its author, Margaret Atwood. Do stay with us here on Impact.
Hello. There's a lot going on with the weather in Europe at the moment. We look at the recent satellite picture, and the first thing to point out is this swirl of cloud moving across the far northwest of the continent. This is the remnants of what was Hurricane Dorian, bringing a band of cloud and heavy rain southeastwards across the British Isles during Tuesday night, sweeping into Scandinavia, northern France, the Low Countries on Wednesday. Behind that, some very brisk winds. Also towards the southwest of the continent, some thunderstorms to the southeast of Spain and the Balearics. Further east, it is quieter. Turkey and Cyprus mainly fine with some sunshine, fine for Romania and Bulgaria, but the odds pretty intense thunderstorm through the Balkans. You can see these very heavy downpours affecting the Balearics and the eastern side of Spain. Could be an awful lot of rain in some of these areas over the next few days, so flash flooding is possible. And then here's our band of cloud and rain associated with the remnants of what was Hurricane Dorian, continuing to drift its way eastwards. We see further wet weather drifting eastwards across Scandinavia as we go through Thursday. Notice these showers and storms, if anything, intensifying across the southeastern portions of Spain. Some really rough weather to come here, actually. Could well cause some travel headaches. Looks pretty unsettled in Madrid as well as we head towards the weekend, cooling off quite significantly. But for Paris and for London, it turns a little warmer than it has been. In Moscow and Kiev, those temperatures heading downwards. Plenty of warm sunshine in Athens.
The latest tech is advancing so fast it can be hard to keep up.
AI might be predicting the fashion of the future.
But there's no need to be overwhelmed.
Island made up of solar panels. Wow, we're walking on water.
This is what it feels like to be on the moon.
Just consult the experts.
This is how you really do it.
Take a look at tomorrow's tech today with Click on BBC World News.
A show bulletproof like doing it in Edinburgh every day for a month.
They're the best audiences here. They're
Right,
just
sure.
the best. They tell you exactly what you think and you're better the next day. They're not going to see something that they've seen before in a way. They're just taking a punt.
Yeah.
And they want to be surprised.
Yeah, sure. I really like your energy and enthusiasm for it.
I love it here. I think it's I always say it's the greatest place on the planet in August. Like, I tell everyone to come here. We have casinos executives coming here because I've told them they have to come here. Just to see it, just to experience. You know, Vegas should be more like Edinburgh.
Early to rise, early in the sack. Thank God I'm a country boy.
Enslaved by Islamic State, Yazidi women are finally going home, but only if they abandon their children fathered by jihadists. Our World, the Yazidi Secret Children, on BBC World News.
This is a view out over the canopy of the largest rainforest in the world. This is the Amazon, and I'm here because of new concerns about what the government of Brazil will do to this place. I'm David Shruckman. Join me for a special report on BBC World News.
Hello, this is Impact, bringing you all the day's top stories. I'm Philippa Thomas. A stark warning on climate change. Rich countries must spend billions to protect against the impact of floods and rising temperatures. The explorer, who went deeper than anyone has gone before, will reveal what it's like to go to the very bottom of all 5 of Earth's oceans. And a television series helped to make The Handmaid's Tale into a feminist classic. Its author tells us about the sequel, a book written more than 3 decades later. That's all coming up here on Impact. Now or pay an even heavier price later. That's the warning from a global commission on the measures that are needed to adapt to climate change. The report says rich countries must invest $1.8 trillion to safeguard livelihoods, food and water supplies. Early warning systems for hurricanes and restoring forests are among the many proposals. Well, I'm joined now by Feike Sijbesma, who's global climate leader for the World Bank Group and a board member of the World Economic Forum and is in Heerlen in the Netherlands. Welcome to Impact. Thank you for joining us. And may I ask you first, you say that business has a vital role to play in increasing this climate resilience. How?
Because business can prepare itself for that future in which climate change is impacting us for our own interest, to be honest, but also do the innovations to help the world. Let's see, we are 4 years after the Paris Agreement, and now we are already derailing from the trajectory we have agreed with more than 200 nations 4 years ago. And therefore we need to talk about climate mitigation as well as adaptation. And business together with government can make a difference. Preparing ourselves for floods, for droughts, for food supply chain interruptions, but also doing the innovations. And you mentioned 1.8 billion investment. Our calculation shows it can give a return of over 7 billion. So it's a good business case as well.
I see very clearly the long-term value to society from those kind of actions that you're outlining. How do businesses sell it to their shareholders?
Well, if we don't act and if we don't make the risk analysis and share that in a transparent way with our investors might become nervous in whom to invest in. That's first, transparency. Secondly, also to make our own operations more resilient. I mean, we have some places maybe as business where we are in danger for floodings, or if there are droughts that our workers do not come to our factories, or if the agriculture food supply chain is interrupted, some businesses might be interrupted by that. So it's just preventing risk. But the third thing is the business case itself, not only preventing risk, but doing innovations. We, as Royal DSM, invented a new algae oil to give to fish in fish farms and not to empty the oceans, which is good for society, but also a good business case because the fish farms would like to buy our product. We developed new products for agriculture in Africa, a good business case as well. So there's money to be earned, so to say, by business as well.
They're all really good examples of best practice, which helps when people are thinking, well, what can we do? Or I think people tend to think, well, this is up to national governments, to actors at a state level. I know something that the reporter said is, well, it's also up to mayors, to community leaders. Things can be done on a smaller level and done right now.
Correct. And let's be honest. I mean, business cannot be successful if they operate in a world that fails. And climate change is really bringing our business into a squeeze in the future. So therefore, we need to work hard on climate mitigation. But as I said, we are already off track of Paris right now. And we need to get back on track, mitigation, but also prepare, and the most vulnerable especially, and therefore prepare on climate adaptation in our own interest and also as a good business case. And we have numerous examples. We develop new materials as Royal DSM, which can make dikes stronger or prevent against hurricanes or floodings, etc. So there's money to be earned, and of course the world will spend money on this. At the end of the day, it is a collaboration between the private and the public sector. The public sector can set rules, the public sector can take care of some blended finance together with the private sector to get us over certain hurdles. But there's a responsibility for the private sector as well.
Fikus Abusma, I'm afraid we have to stop there. Thank you so much, though, for your enthusiasm, but for the expertise that you've brought to us on what can be done right now. Appreciate it. We're going to go to the Bahamas now, where residents on the Abaco Islands are desperately searching for missing loved ones in the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian. Although the official death toll is 45, it is likely to rise because hundreds, possibly thousands of people are still unaccounted for. Meanwhile, those fleeing the Bahamas to the United States to seek refuge have been denied entry unless they hold an official visa. Laura Podesta reports.
Residents of the Abaco Islands in the Bahamas are desperate to leave, even if it means abandoning home and everything familiar.
There's nothing left. There's nothing to do, so all you can do is try find better.
But where to go next is met with a question mark. Outside the Freeport Harbor on Grand Bahama Island Sunday, chaos erupted. Hundreds of hurricane evacuees trying to get into the terminal were met with doors chain-locked by overwhelmed security guards.
Let you come into the USA. You will have problems.
On this ferry, passengers without a U.S. visa were asked to disembark.
At the last minute like this, it's kind of disappointing. It's hurtful.
President Trump defended the decision to only allow true Bahamians in.
I don't want to allow people that weren't supposed to be in the Bahamas to come into the United States, including some very bad people and some very bad gang members and some very, very bad drug dealers.
U.S. Customs and Border Protection says it has deployed an enormous amount of resources to Florida to help hurricane refugees.
We still have to balance the humanitarian need and assistance of those that need it versus the safety of this country. There are still people coming here that could have criminal convictions.
The United Nations says the storm left more than 70,000 people homeless. Laura Podesta, CBS News for BBC News in New York.
And in around half an hour here on Impact, we'll be talking to a journalist who visited Abaco yesterday to get his insight into what's happening on the ground. In his first comments since cancelling a meeting with the Taliban, President Trump has said talks with the group are dead. He said he cancelled talks due to be held over the weekend at Camp David because the militants killed a US soldier in Afghanistan. The Taliban said Americans will lose the most for cancelling. Well, speaking on Monday, the president said meeting with the Taliban was his idea, but that the talks aimed at ending Afghanistan's 18-year war are now dead following this militant attack.
They're dead. They're dead. As far as I'm concerned, they're dead. They thought that they had to kill people in order to put themselves in a little better negotiating position. When they did that, they killed 12 people. One happened to be a great American soldier, a wonderful young man from Puerto Rico, families from Puerto Rico. And you can't do that. You can't do that with me. So they're dead as far as I'm concerned. And we've hit the Taliban harder in the last 4 days than they've been hit in over 10 years. So.
In Hong Kong, a demonstration has taken place at the city's main sporting venue as Hong Kong opens its World Cup qualifying campaign against Iran. The march came as anti-government protests show no sign of abating in the city. Protesters gathering to further reiterate the pro-democracy movement's 5 demands, calling for added freedoms. Our reporter in Hong Kong, Nick Beak, went to meet some of them.
Well, young Hong Kongers are on the march once again this evening. Often we hear about politics being kept out of sport, but bearing in mind the protests we've had for the past 3 months here, the nature of those protests, I think it was inevitable that tonight at this set-piece sporting event, people would want to send a message, and so you've got this sea of red. Young Hong Kongers trying to send a message today that they want greater freedom in the future. They don't want Beijing to dictate their future. This is the first home match of the qualifiers for the 2022 World Cup finals. We've been talking to some of the fans here explaining why they're trying to send a message here tonight.
Because of justice. Hong Kong needs justice. Hong Kong is not China. If you like or you advocate freedom, liberty and democracy, I think people all around the world, they will support us, the Hong Kongers.
The supporters are pretty G'd up tonight, as you can see, and of course this is a match which takes on a different dynamic, and some people have been urging the protesters to actually boo the Chinese national anthem, and we've seen that happen at points during games over the past 4 or 5 years, people showing their displeasure with Beijing. You do get the feeling that tonight it's not about the result on the field, it's the broader battle off the pitch that people have been fighting here for 3 months, the very direction of this city. That's the thing that really counts. The Football Association here in Hong Kong has been fined in the past because of what the governing body FIFA has seen as political gestures. We'll have to see how the fans react tonight, but we do think that they'll form some sort of human change, show their solidarity, and that their fight here in Hong Kong continues.
Nick Beak. The American adventurer Victor Vescovo has become the first person to visit the deepest places in all 5 of Earth's oceans. His final dive, conducted in a prototype submersible, was made to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean's Malloy Trench. That's a depth of 5.5 kilometres. He had already reached the floors of the Pacific, Indian, Southern and Atlantic Oceans. Andy Moore reports.
He's already climbed the highest peaks on 7 continents. Now he's reached the deepest spot in 5 oceans.
5! If you put your mind to it and you get the right people working with you, almost anything is possible.
The final leg of the 5 Deeps expedition took Victor Vescovo and his support ship to a location deep inside the Arctic Circle. His submarine limiting factor went down to a place no human has ever been to before.
Surface, this is the LF. The LF has landed. The LF has landed at bottom.
Okay, roger that. We'll go for a release.
Earlier this year, Mr. Vescovo dived to the deepest spot on the planet, the Mariana Trench in the Pacific Ocean, nearly 11 kilometres down. His 12-ton sub has a titanium core, especially built to withstand huge pressures. The Texan financier has ploughed much of his own wealth into the endeavour.
At bottom.
Even at these incredible depths, there was evidence of human activity. This small pyramid-shaped object in the shadow on the right-hand side is a plastic bag. But there was also evidence of amazing marine animals, some of them new species.
Well done, team. 4 down. Challenger deep.
Unsurprisingly, having explored some of the most inaccessible places on Earth, Mr. Vescovo is now setting sights on his next frontier, space. Andy Moore, BBC News.
One of the year's most eagerly awaited novels has gone on sale. The Testaments is Margaret Atwood's sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, and it returns to the fictional world where women are little more than childbearing slaves. Our arts correspondent Rebecca Jones has been speaking with the author.
The world as she sees it can be a terrifying place, and in a career spanning 5 decades, Margaret Atwood's vision is as disturbing as ever.
Only dead people are allowed to have statues, but I have been given one while still alive.
So starts her latest novel, The Testaments, in which she returns to the nightmare future she created in The Handmaid's Tale.
Blessed be the fruit. May the Lord open.
30 years after she wrote it, the television adaptation brought the book to a vast new audience. In the novel, America is ruled by religious fundamentalists and women are reduced to sexual slavery. Margaret Atwood thinks its message of oppression has never felt more relevant.
Young women of reproductive age are always in the minority in any society. They feel that they're on the verge of having decisions made about them and about their entire future and fate and body and health that they have not been able to decide.
And after the election of Donald Trump, The Handmaid's Tale took on a new resonance. In America and beyond, women have adopted the striking uniform worn by characters in the novel to protest against laws restricting their rights.
It's a brilliant demonstration stratagem because you can't kick them out because they're not saying anything. They're sitting very modestly. And you can't kick them out because they're dressed improperly. They're all covered up. But everybody looking at them knows what they mean.
There's so much hype, fanfare associated with the test.
I apologize.
Well, do you feel any pressure at all?
You know, it is a book. It's not regime change. It's not riots in Moscow. It's not Brexit, dare I say. So it is actually a book.
The wait may be over, but no danger then of Margaret Atwood getting caught up in the excitement. But at the age of 79, having written 50 books and winning more than 100 literary prizes, perhaps that's not surprising. Rebecca Jones, BBC News.
Well, if you want to see more of Rebecca's interview, it's on the BBC online. I'm also just tweeting a link to it. Margaret Atwood talking about her Handmaid's Tale having got a lot closer to reality as she sees it. You can always find me on Twitter at PhilippaBBC and talk to me about any other of our developing stories. I'll be back in 15 minutes after Sport Today, which is coming up for you next.